All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and super excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Abi Blakeslee. Abi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. So Abi integrates somatic experiencing with clinical research, the psychobiological principles of attachment, psychodynamic therapy, and somatic bodywork in her practice and teaching. She conducted original research on the role of implicit memory in somatic experiencing with a committee that included Dr. Daniel Siegel. Dr. Blakeslee holds a Master's of Arts in Counseling and Depth Psychology and a Ph.D. in Clinical and Somatic Psychology. She's interested in the intersection between neuroscience, current trauma research, and the psychobiological principles of somatic experiencing. All right, got through that. Awesome. Abi, welcome. Thanks again for doing this.
Such a pleasure to be here.
All right. So before we get going, I know we talked a little bit about this, but before we started recording, but share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're located now.
Well, we were just talking about my family lineage here because Guy is calling from Oakland. My great-grandmother grew up in Oakland, my grandmother and my father. So the paternal side in California. I grew up right outside of Los Angeles, and now I live in Bozeman, Montana.
Nice.
And I have 3 young children here, and we spend a lot of time in the mountains and fishing and kind of, chasing the outdoors as much as possible.
What just want to diverge a little here, but what brought you out to Montana?
Quality of life, peacefulness. There's a really close-knit community here.
Right.
And the great outdoors. We're going to be talking about the nervous system. But for me and my family, we find a lot of expanse and also settling when we're outdoors together.
Nice.
It connects us to a sense of something greater, and it's exciting. So there's sort of that, there's a charge to it in a positive way. And then it's also deeply peaceful, which would be more, parasympathetic, rest and digest. So it's really just having that kind of the sense of regulation in the environment, which is different. And for me in Los Angeles, there's a lot of go, go, go.
Right.
So I feel for many that live in cities, there's a real pressure and demand on our nervous systems, right? To produce, to stay aware, to be an alert. So I think in those kinds of environments, we have to be even more conscientious of our evolution and take time to be outside, see long distances, or even just snuggle up, settle in, take time for that rest and recuperation phase of life.
Right. Wow. I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, that resonates with me. We can talk about that later. We're going to talk about somatic experiencing and your interest in it and focus on the neuroscience and so forth. But before we do, can we kind of really hear your story of how you got here in the first place? What inspired that in you?
Well, way back, I discovered that if I gave my parents massages, they would buy me ice cream.
Okay.
Yep. And at Baskin Robbins, they had the Matterhorn, which was, all different kinds of ice cream with whipped cream and chocolate sauce. And so I learned very early on kind of a love of body work and the body. And I got really good at finding knots. I'd put dimes into phone books to see if I could feel where it was. And And so it was a reward. It was just kind of a, basic little bit of dopamine there early on. And I became really curious about how bodies moved and tension patterns. And after college, went into bodywork school, became a body worker. For several years, I was doing polarity and deep tissue work. And I started to become curious about how I might be working on one part of the body and a memory would emerge for someone, maybe something they hadn't thought about in 20 years. Or there would be a large emotional release that would happen when I worked on a muscle. So I started to get curious about this mind-body connection piece. And I had a mentor, bodywork mentor of mine, recommend Dr. Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger and Ram Dass, How Can I Help? And I read both of those, and I was struck by Dr. Levine's work and how, after many years in the autonomic nervous system and in the body, we can have an imprint of things that happened to us long ago, but it's more non-conscious, just like in the musculature, right? So it can be held for long periods of time. And that actually led me into my master's program and then into my Ph.D. program. Mm-hmm. And I let go of body work for a period of time and really focused on, psychodynamic work and clinical work. And through SE-oriented touch work, began to integrate the two later in my career. It was kind of like coming home again. But I found that somatic experiencing has really been the foundation for the way that I perceive trauma healing. I think it's one of the, and I'm biased, I teach somatic experiencing, but the reason why I teach it is that I just stuck with it for a decade. And then I became a faculty member. So I've been in the field for close to 2 decades.
Wow.
And I think it has one of the best sort of progressive learning tools. It's something that we can teach our clients to be able to do themselves. And there are skills and there are tools to be able to tend to our responses that are non-conscious. Right? Or some are non-conscious and some are unconscious. Right? Some things that we'll never really be able to pay attention to, but we can pay attention to internal things that are happening with these survival responses that are right there in the lower brain, right? That are hard to access without these kinds of tools. So that's one of the things that really excites me. You're asking me about my passion. And I love this work. I really do. And for many people, it's the missing piece.
Now, when you found somatic experiencing, SE, and read Peter Levine's work, I mean, for those people who aren't familiar with it, I mean, it's about trauma, right? I mean, how did you how did you move into that whole topic, right? You talked initially about the body and memories and so forth, but of course, now you're moving into this or being introduced to the topic of trauma. How did you move into that and how did that interact with you?
Well, at first it was really just a basic curiosity about human nature and how are we the way we are, and wanting to gather more information. Being a body worker, really they call it the issues and the tissues, right? Having some openness around looking at kind of the lower level responses, and then how we think we are who we are, right? We have all of these ideas of who we are, but we have these kind of habits and ways of being that we've learned long ago that are part of the continuum of our experience. So I started one of the SE trainings as a body worker before I went into my mental health education. And I remember in somatic experiencing beginning 1, I started to feel things. I'd been a dancer prior to that, so I had musculoskeletal knowledge. And I thought I was very embodied, which I was. But I didn't recognize that there's a whole universe inside of ourselves. It's as if the nervous system is a poem that unfolds, right? We can have feelings that are sparkly or undulating or soft or fluid. We can have feelings of a pillar or a column. Yeah. It can be vaporous.
Mm-hmm.
But the learning what we call something called interoception, which is a term that was developed by Dr. Bud Craig, who's a neuroscientist. It's a wonderful book called How Do You Feel? Mm-hmm. Not for the faint of heart. It is definitely a neuroscience book. But they talk about this ability of a part of your brain called the insula, or the insular cortex, to consciously become aware of internal sensation. And when you have multiple sensations happening at any time, and your insula will not light up, meaning there's not blood flow, metabolic activity on a MRI machine. But when you become conscious of a sensation, this part of the brain lights up. So it's conscious attention to internal sensation. And this is actually super interesting because they find that long-term meditators actually have thicker right anterior insula. The work of Sarah Lazar. And then there's another researcher named Critchley who looks at empathy. And people who have a better ability to sense their heart rate, so it's higher interoception, they score higher on empathy tests. And so we can look at this ability to feel yourself helps us to have a better sense of feeling others, feeling connected with others, right? Which is something that certainly gets lost in trauma, right? Our capacity to be able to take in, right? Or be able to focus on relationship or feel safe in a relationship. Porges talks about the neuroception of safety, right? But coming back to that full circle here with that sensory experience, I discovered a whole universe inside of myself. And I noticed where I felt vibrant and alive. So I call that resilient. I also noticed where I felt terror, where I felt constriction in relationship to certain events or current triggers, where I might go numb or feel spacey. It gave me a whole new reference point for these things that were happening kind of under my conscious radar all of the time. Wow. And an ability to process those things from what we call the autonomic level or that lower level.
Okay. So that was going on for you when you were, as a result of getting into this SE course?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I had a few different responses. You know, I think you mentioned about trauma. Yeah. And we can look at somatic experiencing as a trauma resolution model. But there's another side to it. I really like the idea of also calling it a resiliency building model. Because what's on the other side, when we become less constricted, when we come out of freeze, when we discharge or release or get more organized in our nervous system, become more present to the current moment, this is where we have more resilience. We have more sense of flow, capacity, capability.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. As you just said that, it reminded me of a discussion I had with Lisa Danilchuk, and she just published a book, and she was talking about that too. She was saying, yes, there's trauma and attention to that and working on that, but what about kind of the other side of that? You know, she was talking, it reminded me of bringing attention to this other aspect. So I really appreciate that. So what happened in your personal experience as you started becoming working with people in this context?
Yeah. So through the somatic experiencing training, it's a 3-year training for professionals. I was doing my own personal work, somatic personal work, and then also working in an agency and then also in private practice, and really teaching people skills and tools to slow down and to become curious about what their internal state is in the moment. So somatic means body oriented, and experiencing is a verb. So it's the experience of the body in the present moment. And the healing happens in the here and now. We can talk about different events that happened, but as someone is talking, I might be tracking or noticing what's happening in their nervous system or in their body. And then I'll ask, as you talk about the stress that you feel when you're driving to work, stuck in traffic in Oakland, what sensations do you notice in your body right now? Yeah. And so that would be a question that we could explore and to sort of see where a person might be getting stuck, where there might be, we call either trauma or less resilience, and it's on a spectrum there. But let's say that's something that someone wanted to work on, and they're feeling anxiety. Now, there are two branches of the nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system for excitation, and we have the parasympathetic nervous system for relaxation. And in many of these kinds of somatic models, if you have two lines, you can imagine two lines, and then you have a wave that goes in between. We have a, soft on, soft off, soft on, soft off. So sympathetic and parasympathetic are somewhat reciprocal throughout the day, right? And we get a little bit stressed and then we settle back down again, a little bit stressed and we settle back down again. Now with trauma, what can happen is we can get into a cycle of dysregulation, where we move outside of that window of tolerance into a high sympathetic response. Now, when we are threatened, it could be real or perceived threat, we go into something called the threat response cycle. This is a time-limited evolutionary pathway that we move through, and then we should, given time, given support, return back to this kind of baseline in a sense. So we move into the high sympathetic charge. Let's say somebody swerves over towards you. You're driving the car. They swerve towards you, and you go into a sense of alert. Then you orient through your five senses towards the threat. Yeah. And then you move into a sympathetic, right, excitation in order for action. Do I need to swerve? Do I need to hit the brake? Right? What do I do? This is a lower brain reaction. It's happening underneath your conscious radar, thank goodness. You're not thinking through every little movement. It's an instinctual response. And then the car, let's say, swerves back. They're texting. Right? Maybe get a little angry. How dare they be texting, say something. And then you start to settle back down again. At this point, your heart is pumping, you're breathing fast, your blood is circulating for action. There's several other things that happen. You're not digesting your food. Yeah. And then, you get a little wobbly or shaky, a little tingly. You track your sensations when you come down of high sympathetic charge. You start to feel some of these kinds of quakiness, shakiness, trembliness, tingliness, vibration. And it's really as things start to settle back down again, and then softening, expansion, warmth, gurgling in the tummy, heaviness in the limbs. Yeah. And kind of coming back to a resting state. So I might be tracking that with somebody as they're talking about maybe someone doesn't swerve into their lane, but now they're feeling stressed all the time. They're driving and they're consistently in this high autonomic alert state. It's not healthy for their system, right? You want to be able to move into it and then return to some level of a baseline. Now, another thing that can happen, and I think this is a great gift of Peter Levine's work, and some that Dana and other people are talking about in polyvagal theory, which is there's also another parasympathetic response that we and animals move into when there is real or perceived life threat, more severe life threat. It's a passive defensive response called a freeze response. And we think about this like with the possum.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's a everything stop, play dead. In the wild, this offers an opportunity for prey. Sometimes the predator will be not so interested in an inert meal. Yeah. So the coyotes will sniff the possum and then think, it doesn't smell good. It's not moving. It must be old. And they move on. Or the predator can actually drag the prey over or sit with the prey, either get distracted or not be interested in it. There's a lot of really interesting videos of impalas being caught by jaguars and other kinds of large cats. And baboons come over and chase the big cats away. I don't know why, but the baboons seem to be very interested. So you can type in baboons and impalas on YouTube and see this. But so the predator gets distracted, and you'll see this the animal coming out of freeze, again through shaking and trembling. If I were to ask the impala, it'd probably be tingling and coming out of a feeling of being very cold and constricted into high heat. Right. And then moving down into warmth, sweating. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes some water will come out of its eyes. Yeah. And it'll start to salivate again after having a very dry mouth. And then they will pop up and run away. So human beings, we have this same ability. At the same time, when we're in a freeze, it's an analgesic. So it's a numbing response. So if we're injured, we won't feel it. Yeah. So when we have times where freeze, again, should be time limited, there are going to be times where we're so overwhelmed, our bodies will decide to go in a passive defensive response, and we'll go into shutdown. Or we'll get so terrified, right? Or there's a kind of a more helpless situation where there's inescapable attack, and we'll go into a freeze response. Mm-hmm. Given time, given support, the body comes out of it. But without those conditions, we might remain in a freeze response at a baseline, or be triggered into that freeze response when there's something in the environment that is similar enough, or our lower brain assesses is similar enough to the original trauma. And this is what's so frustrating for so many trauma survivors, is they're so smart. We're smart. If we decided to just be better, we would be. But why am I feeling afraid? Why am I having social anxiety? Why am I feeling depressed and shut down? Why is it so hard for me to motivate to get out of bed? Why is it I freeze every time that I'm, trying to fill out the form for the job application? Why is it I'm having such a hard time connecting with my partner? When they're upset with me about a little thing, I go into this deep shutdown, right? And close off. So, right, we have these patterns that are part of a survival response. Our body was trying to keep us safe, did keep us safe because we're still here. But it's the repetition of that response which becomes dysregulation. Mm-hmm. In a current situation where we might want some more flexible responses available to us. So tracking the freeze, allowing the release cycle to happen with time. Sometimes with Dr. Peter Levine's work too, and this is not as it's not as utilized in many other theories, as we call it the completion of defensive responses. In procedural memory, which is non-conscious, they're movement patterns. So the person, as they come out of freeze, might have this feeling of running or escaping. They might have a feeling of punching or standing up for themselves. So I've worked many times with kids who've been bullied. Mm-hmm. Right? And they've been surrounded by bullies, right, and physically harmed. So they went into a freeze response. And as we track, notice the freeze response, spend some time, they feel my support, they notice they're not in that situation now. They're coming out of numbness. They start to feel cold and a little trembly, and maybe there's a little shakiness or a little vibration. Could be just under the skin, or it could actually become a little bit more to the surface. And as they're coming out, they're saying, I really wanted to scream. I wanted to say something. I wanted, I don't know why anybody helped me. Mm-hmm. I said, feel the agency in your body right now. You wanted to say, help me. So right here and now, would you be willing just to say that, help me? Yeah. And notice what it feels like to use your voice in this moment. Mm-hmm. And I'm right here with you. You are receiving help now. There wasn't anybody there then, but I'm here now, and notice that and take some time, right, in the repair. And then, as they're coming on it again, and they start to feel tension in their arms. And I said, just let that tension happen. And they go, that's so weird. My hands are in fists, right? Or my leg feels like it wants to kick. And I say, well, let your body feel the power of that and go slowly and notice how that is. And then through the body, a lot of the time, the story will come forward. And they say, it's so weird. It's as if I wanted to kick them away. That's right. I imagine that there was that, right? Underneath the freeze, there's that feeling of wanting to punch or kick or get away or stand up for yourself. So let's do that now.
Mm-hmm. So let me just interrupt. So just for the benefit of our listeners, what are you doing as you're walking that client through that self-awareness in that moment?
There are two pieces to this. So one is called tracking, where we are together, we're following their internal sensory experience to notice what the body wants to do now. So we're going to be watching and listening and following. So if the body starts to tremble, I'll say, let that happen. If the body starts to tighten, we might follow that tightening to see if there's a movement pattern that comes up, right? Or if I see the person sitting up more straight, I'll say, right, so I'm attending. Mm-hmm. Are you noticing how your spine just straightened? How does that feel to you? Okay. I feel more here. Wonderful. So be in that we're tracking, we're following. Now, there is another piece in somatic experiencing, when our students are learning SE, there's this feeling that it can be very intuitive. And yet we're actually quite conscious sometimes of where we might direct a client's attention. And there are a few things about that. One is that if there is an autonomic, like a release, like a discharge, but somewhere else is tensing or somewhere else is, right, feeling disconnected, we might direct a person's attention to that release cycle. Yeah. Or we might direct a person's attention, let's say if an area is feeling really good and an area is feeling really uncomfortable. Depending on the person, for many people, they haven't felt good in 20 years. Right. And they're used to following the discomfort. So we say, let's not pay attention to that lump and solid feeling in your neck. You just said that your chest just opened, or there's a softening in your shoulders. Before we go to that feeling in your neck, would you be willing to take some time with the softness in your shoulders? So we might actually be very directive in our attention. And in the softening of the shoulders, let's see now that the tension could increase in the throat, or it may soften. As it softens, maybe an emotion comes, right? Maybe some tears the person hasn't been able to feel for a period of time. So that's sort of what one of the things I'm noticing. We're tracking, we're following, and I'm also helping a person to discharge or release incomplete defensive responses connected to something in the past and to how the nervous system is firing in the present moment. And also making sure that they're not getting trapped in the trauma vortex. And we might be moving trauma vortex, meaning negative sensations, uncomfortable feelings, dysregulation, dis-ease. Right. And starting to build a capacity to move towards where they feel better, where they feel more whole, what resources they have. what they think about, resources that make them feel more like themselves, more present, but also embodied resources, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love this. I love that kind of drilling down into almost the minutia and the specifics of how someone is feeling. And I like the way you talked about it, is kind of bringing their attention away from that maybe pattern that they're used to paying attention to, that quote unquote negative experience. But well, let's look at the softness in here for once, right? And the power behind that, potential power behind that, in a sense.
Absolutely. Sometimes I call it the parasympathetic domino effect, to where, if you feel and attend to a place, even if it's 3 to 5% change, and for many trauma survivors, that's what we're looking for. Right. We're learning to track and attend to the small amounts of betterness in the nervous system, in the body, in the overall experience, in the here and now. Right. And some people will notice a much deeper response in the somatic experiencing work. They can get to 75% betterness by just attending to it. Just kind of one part starts to settle, another part starts to gurgle, another part starts to soften. And the brain and the amygdala, which is on this alert, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong, goes, oh, my shoulders are soft. Maybe nothing is wrong right now. Okay, let's kind of dial down that cortisol. Don't have to do all that stress response. Catecholamines in the brain start to calm down here. You don't need to keep firing. And then we go into more of that, a downshift. We call it down regulation. Now, there is an interesting piece here. I do want to mention, sometimes we actually might need to steer someone towards the trauma vortex. This would be somebody who might be a little bit more in the all is good category. Everything's great. Everything's fine. And also sometimes long-term meditators, for example, where there could be a way of, there's an embodied kind of pathway towards meditation, right? And working with altered states or different states of consciousness. There's also some really interesting research to show that there can be almost like a trained dissociation. So it feels really good to disconnect, but dissociation is also a trauma response of disconnecting from the body, kind of floating out there, being away from the corporal experience because it feels like too much. But when somebody lands back in, all of that dysregulation is still there. So they have to keep sort of going out. It's a more functional way, right? It's not as distressing. But we might have to say, no, don't go into that blissful state of transcendence. Come back. What's the feeling that's underneath when you're here that makes you want to go away to that place? What is the tension? What is the distress? What is the stuckness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And the purpose behind that is what, aside from you moving someone away from, or kind of inviting them away from this dissociation into the here and now, to be able to kind of open up that kind of door to the feelings behind the trauma, in a sense.
Right. And we have a lot of different ways to work with that. So sometimes just being with it, your conscious attention, tracking your internal sensation, including negative sensation, your body will start to shift. So a common question we ask is, as you feel, I'll use a trauma vortex sensation, as you feel that tension in your chest, how big is it? Does it have a shape, a size, a color? As you feel that, what begins to happen next? Does it increase? Does it decrease, or stay the same? So for some people, it'll decrease. They'll feel better, right? We're moving in a right direction. For other people, maybe it's stuck. So I say, well, what else is there? We'll move the attention somewhere else and help the system sort of move along. Other times it will increase, get more uncomfortable. For many people spending time in the body, they leave their bodies for good reasons. Right. And so when we start to come back into the reassociation process and into some of the sensations of the freeze and the terror and the fight and the flight, it's not easy. So we may also need to take some breaks, stabilize in the external environment, look around, right? Find some objects in the room that the person likes. Explore the room through the 5 senses. Chit-chat a little bit in the neocortex, kind of come out of that. And then we're going to tap back in a little bit, touch back in. Are you feeling any different now? Or what are you aware of? Peter Levine calls it titration. It's like a drop-by-drop model. And so it comes from chemistry, changing a base to an acid. You have to put the drop in and let the solution settle. And they have, I think of all of those 1980s videos with the kids have to wear the goggles, right? Or the mad scientists, right? Have to wear the goggles because if they put too much in, it explodes. Yep. And in those movies, they came out with blackened hair and soot all over their faces. And so that's that idea that drop by drop for some people, we're not going to kind of go all at it at once. And then it's a slow process of touching into the nervous system, allowing a little bit of reorganization, moving attention to different aspects, moving the system through time, coming back out into the environment, into the present moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Abi, man, I'm just looking at the time here. This could go on forever. I mean, there's so much richness here. I really appreciate it. I didn't even get to asking you about the awareness, and and I love talking about this, the awareness of the person doing this, the therapist. That's just, what's required. I mean, you talked a lot about your background as a body worker and a dancer. I mean, but as we close out here, the people who are listening to this, I know they're getting, oh my God, this sounds so intense. If someone is interested in learning more about this and maybe even jumping in, and where would you direct them?
Yeah, so I would highly recommend going to our professional website, which is traumahealing.org. So if you're a professional and you're interested in learning about somatic experiencing, we have articles, we have wonderful training programs all over the world. If you are interested in receiving somatic experiencing, we have a practitioner directory, and you can click on there and you can look for providers in your area. If there's no provider in your area, you can also look for people who do online work. And you mentioned, it's intense work, but it's also can be exquisitely gentle. Because we are working in this titrated way, it really helps people begin to have this deeper sense of wholeness, when they can connect to that sense of source and sense of self and allow some of the release or the reorganization. It's a real relief to the nervous system. And like I said, it really can be the missing piece for many people. I really encourage everyone to try it. It's made a huge difference for me in my life, which is why I teach the work now.
Well, that's awesome. So, you mentioned a few books, Ram Dass and How Do You Feel by, was that Bud Craig?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll have those listed up. And of course, Peter Levine's work and so forth. But aside from that, and it doesn't have to be trauma related or not, I can see the bountiful of books behind you. What kind of go-to book recommendation would you have for listeners? Something that's kind of stands out to you?
Well, the Peter Levine book that I really love is In an Unspoken Voice, which is the newest book. He also has a great book called Trauma and Memory. If you're a therapist, you might find some real interest in that because it's all about implicit memory and working with that kind of play by play. I read a lot of different things. I mean, recently, Bud Craig is he's really my hero. And that's all of that work on interoception, which I find so fascinating. Of course, there's Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. Deb Dana has a great clinical application of polyvagal theory. She has her own modality, but SC has been working with polyvagal theory for, I think we were one of the first therapies that recognized it and started using it in a clinical model. So I'd say those are my go-to books. There's also Maggie Klein and Peter Levine have wonderful books, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes. And if you're a parent or a caregiver, they also have Trauma Proofing Your Kids. And they're excellent somatic approaches to working with kids. And of course, I have young ones, so and I work with kids and families. So it's a great primer to kind of bring this work and embodiment practices, because we can do this when we're older, but we can also begin to bring it right from the get-go into young people's lives. And that's very exciting to me.
Awesome. Well, Abi, it's been a delight having you on here. And you definitely gave us like this mini masterclass in somatic experience. I want to thank you. so much for coming on board here.
You're welcome. It's been such a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.